In terms of government intervention, there has been government intervention not just at the budget but before the budget. In terms of the Equality Authority, and we've just given you the highlights, there's more detail of more examples of government intervention. I suppose in terms of the Equality Authority, probably the most significant ones were in 2003, the proposed location of the Equality Authority to Rossgrey, without really any rationale for that move to Rossgrey, particularly when the legal system is still based in Dublin and casework will have to eventually go through a legal system. And I don't believe the public transport connections to Rossgrey are great. In terms of 2007, we had the appointment of a new board. The board that was in place was not reappointed. So you had a huge loss of institutional memory, and you had new board members coming to take on a role very quickly. So there was an entirely new board appointed then. In 2008, there was a number of changes made, which included additional ministerial board appointments. So we had 4 new board appointments made by the minister. And then in 2008, the minister appointed a departmental representative to the board of the Equality Authority. And I should say that both the Equality Authority and the Human Rights Commission sit and report directly to the Minister of Justice, Equality and Law Reform, for anybody who wasn't aware of that. In terms of the Human Rights Commission, there was a lot of controversy, I don't know how many of you remember, around the appointment of the first round of human rights commissioners. There was a process set up. It was a peculiar process, which we'll have detailed in the report, but there was suggested appointments made. The minister took some from the first list, some from the second list, and some from someplace else. So there was the questions around the ministerial appointments in the first round of commissioners. And then again in 2006, while the process was changed, there are still questions around the transparency of that process. And then, of course, in 2008, prior to the cuts, you had the proposed merger of the 5 organisations. So, I mean, you can see a series of, and there are other interventions. There was changes in the terms of appointment of the CEO in 2004. And there was changes in 2003 in terms of the legislation and where complaints on discrimination in pubs moved from the Equality Tribunal to the courts, which meant that less cases were coming to the Equality Authority. So there has been other changes. We're just trying to give you a flavour of some of the changes. Okay, so autumn 2008 saw the NCCRI abolished. It saw Combat Poverty Agency merged with the Office for Social Inclusion. In the Department of Justice, there's 35 agencies sit under the vote of the Department of Justice, and it was really interesting that it was the social organisations that were affected under those budget cuts. The budget cuts, 24% there was a 24% proposed budget cut for the Irish Human Rights Commission, which on 2.3 million is a very significant cut on what is not an enormous budget by any means. And in the case of the Equality Authority the cut was minus 43% on a total budget of 5.4 million. So the percentages on total percentages, which aren't huge in the first place, would have made life very difficult in terms of continuing work as usual. In terms of the impact of the budget cuts on the Human Rights Commission, when we met the Human Rights Commission, they said to us, look, this is what we did to try and deal with the cuts. So there was in-house savings, there was very practical things, there was to be no more printing, documents were to be put online, there was these very kind of immediate things that were put into effect. All temporary posts were terminated and all external consultancy was terminated. Staff who left were not replaced. So the Commission is currently functioning on minimal staffing levels. And if staff leave now, they will not be replaced. So that leaves the Commission in quite a vulnerable staffing situation. The Commission has discontinued its legal fees. So it's asking barristers to work on a pro bono basis on cases. And the Commission solicitors now handle all work, whereas before they would have brought in other people to handle. So obviously that'll slow down the capacity of the Commission to deal with work. Inquiries are held in private, not public, because of the costs associated with it. and there's simply a lower pace of handling casework, less staff, more work to be done. So how could there not be a lower pace of handling casework? The Human Rights Commission has continued to protest to government about the cuts. Every time you hear the Human Rights Commission or you hear them talking about the impact of the cuts and how difficult it is to do their work. So they protested about the cuts when they happened and have continued to protest continually about the cuts and the impact of the cuts on their work. In terms of the impact of the cuts on the Equality Authority, because of the lack of engagement of the Equality Authority, it's very hard for us to verify the impacts. What we can do is tell you some of the factual information. The staffing levels have been reduced. So there was a 0.7 million cut in staff budgets. So a huge percentage of staff are lost to the organisation, have been absorbed back into the main parent department. Activities have been reduced. There's been a 1.859 million cut in the budget for activities. The Equality Authority in some written submissions attributed two changes to the cuts. They attributed the reduction in the equality scheme from 100 participants to 40, and they said that there was a reduction in the equality mainstreaming projects, but they weren't very specific about what that meant. Oops, sorry. Go back. It's interesting to note that before the cuts and now, and there is a continuing trend in the fall in the number of information inquiries. There's a general fall in the level of inquiries to the Equality Authority. I suppose we could speculate that some of that is the controversy about the Equality Authority. People are wondering, is it still in existence? Where is it? But all of that is in the realms of speculation. All we wanted to do was just to say that that was what was happening. I suppose because we asked the consultees that we spoke to did they have comments or what were their perceptions of the impact of the cuts on the two bodies. The consultees would have said that the two bodies had very different approaches, and some consultees would have been more familiar with one body than another. So people were able to say, well, look, I know something about the Equality Authority, I know very little, and vice versa. But it was clear that the two bodies had very different approaches. The Commission has said the cuts are making life very difficult. We really are. The Equality Authority appears to be business as usual. The NGOs we consulted believed, in their opinion, that the Equality Authority had been more affected, certainly from their perspective. And they cited a number of reasons for this. Their evidence was that there was fewer significant cases being processed through the Equality Authority. The business case for equality, which the Equality Authority had made very strongly, had really been left to one side, and that the fall in the number of SMEs participating in schemes was just letting that agenda slide. There was a dramatic decline in media coverage apart from obviously the impact of the cuts. There was a decline in media coverage, and there was significantly less NGO engagement by the Equality Authority with the NGO community, whereas before there would have been engagement in subgroups, and there is some limited, but it's not at anything like the extent or volume that it would have been. Oops, sorry, did I miss one? So I'm giving you really an overview. Brian is going to speak to the question of independence.